Picture this. It's January 1927, Fifth Avenue, New York City. And thousands of ordinary citizens are lining up outside a limestone château that takes up an entire city block. A building most of them have walked past their entire lives but never seen inside. They're paying 50 cents each, not to see a museum, not to tour a monument. They're paying for one last glimpse of something that's about to vanish forever. In 1 week, this building, all 137 rooms, 6 stories, and $3 million of Gilded Age excess, will cease to exist. The largest private home ever built in New York City. Gone. How does that happen? This is the story of the Vanderbilt Mansion that mysteriously disappeared. And I mean mysteriously, because here's what makes this fascinating. We're not talking about some forgotten country estate that slowly crumbled over centuries. We're talking about 1 West 57th Street, prime Manhattan real estate, the heart of what was called Millionaire's Row. A palace that took a decade to acquire the land for, 18 months of round-the-clock construction, and $3,018,093, roughly $100 million today, to build. A home with its own name in the society pages, an address that meant you'd arrived at the absolute pinnacle of American wealth and power. And it lasted 44 years. 44 years from completion to complete demolition. If you enjoy these deep dives into America's lost architectural masterpieces, hit subscribe. These documentaries take weeks to research and produce, and your support genuinely helps. Drop a comment at the end and let me know which vanished Gilded Age mansion should I cover next. Here's what we're going to explore: how Cornelius Vanderbilt II built the largest private palace in American history, why it could never last despite all his wealth, and what the story of this vanished mansion tells us about the impermanence of even the grandest fortunes. Because this isn't just about one demolished building. It's about what happens when an entire era and everything it believed in suddenly becomes obsolete. To understand how this palace came to be, you need to understand the man who built it. And to understand Cornelius Vanderbilt II, you need to understand the extraordinary circumstances of his birth. He was born in 1843, not to wealth exactly, but to the possibility of unimaginable wealth. His grandfather was the Commodore, Cornelius Vanderbilt, already building what would become one of history's great fortunes in shipping and railroads. His father was William H. Vanderbilt, the Commodore's son, learning the railroad business. Young Cornelius, they called him Cornel, was the eldest son, the favorite grandson. And in families like the Vanderbilts, being the eldest son of the eldest son meant everything. The Commodore died in 1877, leaving the staggering sum of $100 million, more than the United States Treasury held at that moment. Think about that. One man, wealthier than the entire federal government. Most of that fortune went to William, Cornel's father, but the Commodore hadn't forgotten his favorite grandson. Cornelius II received $5 million in his grandfather's will. $5 million in 1877 as let's call it a starter inheritance. But that was just the beginning. In 1885, when Cornelius was 42 years old, his father died. William H. Vanderbilt had multiplied the family fortune, nearly doubled it in just 8 years. And when his will was read, Cornelius II inherited approximately $70 million. Let that sink in for a moment. $70 million in 1885. In today's terms, we're talking about multiple billions. Estimates range from $2 to $3 billion when adjusted for inflation. At age 42, Cornelius Vanderbilt II became one of the wealthiest men in America, possibly the world. But here's what separates Cornelius II from the stereotype of the lazy heir. He worked. Seriously worked. When his father died, Cornelius didn't just inherit the money. He inherited the job. Chairman and president of the New York Central Railroad, the backbone of the Vanderbilt Empire, connecting New York City to the Great Lakes and Chicago. Under his leadership, the railroad continued to dominate American transportation. Contemporary accounts describe him as serious, industrious, focused. The New York Times in 1893 wrote, "He has no fads or hobbies. He is a man of strong domestic tastes and finds his chief enjoyment in the family circle." This wasn't the caricature of the dissolute rich man. This was someone who genuinely believed in the dignity of work, even if his work was managing a fortune larger than most nations' GDP. And he had married well. In 1867, at age 24, Cornelius had wed Alice Claypool Gwynn. They'd met teaching Sunday school at St. Bartholomew's Church, a detail that paints a picture of two wealthy young people who saw themselves as moral, upstanding pillars of society. Alice came from a respectable Cincinnati family. Not Vanderbilt-level wealth, but solid upper-class credentials. By all accounts, it was a love match. They would have 7 children together, though 2 would die young. A reminder that even unlimited money couldn't protect against 19th century mortality. The New York Times described Alice as an ideal wife and mother, refined and dignified. And as we'll see, she would prove far tougher and more pragmatic than that gentle description suggests. By the 1890s, Cornelius II and Alice were the power couple of New York society. Not just wealthy, the wealthiest Vanderbilt. Not just influential, the keepers of the family legacy. But here's where the story gets more complex. Because public opinion about men like Cornelius Vanderbilt was conflicted. On one hand, there was genuine admiration. Cornelius and Alice were philanthropists. They supported the YMCA, the Salvation Army, churches, hospitals. They were patrons of the arts. They represented, to many Americans, what wealth should look like when wielded responsibly. Society pages praised them. Invitations to Vanderbilt events were the most coveted in New York. Their name opened every door. But there was another narrative running parallel, and it was growing louder. This was the 1890s, the height of what Mark Twain had already named the Gilded Age, a time when the gap between rich and poor yawned wider than ever before in American history. When industrial barons built fortunes on the backs of workers earning pennies a day. When robber baron was not yet a historical term, but a contemporary accusation. Populist critics were harsh. They saw the Vanderbilts and their peers as symbols of everything wrong with American capitalism. Richard Hofstadter would later analyze how people lumped people like Cornelius Vanderbilt among those whose money power was blamed for societal ills. The railroads that built the Vanderbilt fortune, they'd been constructed by immigrant labor working brutal hours for subsistence wages. The shipping empire before that, built in an era of cutthroat competition, where bankrupting rivals was considered smart business. Cornelius himself hadn't been the architect of those fortunes. He'd inherited them. But he was their beneficiary. And increasingly, America was asking uncomfortable questions about inherited wealth. So here's the paradox. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, at the peak of his power in the 1890s, was simultaneously one of the most admired and most resented men in America. Admired by those who saw him as a responsible steward of wealth. Resented by those who saw that wealth itself as fundamentally unjust. And the mansion he was about to build would become the ultimate symbol of both those reactions. Because Cornelius Vanderbilt II was about to do something audacious, even by Gilded Age standards. He was going to build a palace, not a large house, not an impressive residence, a palace. The largest private home in the largest city in America. And that decision, that statement in stone and marble, would set in motion everything that followed. The story of how Cornelius built his palace actually begins a decade before construction, with an act of patient, expensive determination. In 1879, Cornelius purchased a lot at the corner of Fifth Avenue and West 57th Street. The address would be 1 West 57th Street, the northwest corner of what was rapidly becoming the most prestigious residential street in America. Fifth Avenue in the 1870s and 80s was transforming. New York's old money was moving north, away from the cramped streets of Lower Manhattan. Brownstone row houses were giving way to larger, more impressive residences. And 57th Street, then the northern frontier of elite settlement, was prime territory. But here's where it gets interesting. Cornelius didn't just buy one lot. Over the next decade, he systematically acquired 5 adjoining brownstone houses, extending north to 58th Street. One by one, as they became available, he bought them out. Harper's Weekly noted in 1882 that these acquisitions were costly, and that's an understatement. This wasn't just expensive because of the properties themselves. It was expensive because existing owners knew exactly who was buying. When Cornelius Vanderbilt comes knocking, asking to purchase your home because he needs your land for his mansion, the price goes up. By the late 1880s, he owned the entire block front, a full city block on Fifth Avenue, one of the rarest and most valuable parcels of land in New York. To put this in perspective, most wealthy New Yorkers had townhouses. Large, impressive, but still townhouses. One building on one lot, however grand. Cornelius was assembling real estate for something unprecedented. Not a house, an estate, in the middle of Manhattan. In 1883, Cornelius hired architect George B. Post to design a large brownstone château-style house on his new property. It was impressive, by any normal standard, a mansion. But within a decade it wasn't enough. Because this was the Gilded Age, and this was Fifth Avenue, and there was an informal but very real competition happening among America's wealthiest families. Who could build the most impressive house? Whose residence would be the residence? The Astors had their fortress-like mansion. The Goulds were building. Other Vanderbilts, Cornelius's cousins and relatives, were constructing their own palaces up and down Fifth Avenue and in Newport. Cornelius looked at his 1883 house and made a decision. He was going to rebuild. Bigger. Far bigger. He brought George B. Post back, but this time he added someone special: Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt was America's preeminent architect for the ultra-wealthy. He'd designed the base of the Statue of Liberty. He'd studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He was, by the 1890s, the architect if you wanted to make an architectural statement. Together, Post and Hunt designed something extraordinary. The model was French Renaissance, specifically inspired by the Château de Blois in France's Loire Valley. This wasn't going to be a brownstone. This was going to be a limestone château that looked like it had been transplanted from the French countryside into the heart of Manhattan. The interior designers? Jules Allard and Sons, the elite Parisian firm that decorated European palaces. They would import paneling, ceilings, furnishings, whole rooms essentially from France. This wasn't just construction. This was an international operation, pulling the finest materials and craftsmen from around the world to one city block in New York. On March 1st, 1892, demolition began. Cornelius razed the brownstones he'd spent years acquiring. The 1883 house was dramatically expanded, and something impossible started rising from the Manhattan bedrock. The project would employ 600 workers. It would run 24 hours a day in shifts, with electric arc lights illuminating the site at night, a marvel in itself. And it would take 18 months. 18 months to build the largest private residence in America. The cost? Approximately $3 million. In 1893, to put that in modern terms, roughly $100 million for a house. Not a hotel, not an apartment building, not a museum. A house. For one family. When the New York Times saw the finished product in late 1893, they called it the finest private residence in America. A palace. They weren't exaggerating.